real quick preface to it before we see the clip. So I do a lot of kind of playing around with particle illusion as part of my, day-to-day efforts as product manager, and we all do. And we often, work on little projects and things like that. But I've never really personally used particle illusion to do sort of a big production or really pushed it to its limits. And I wanted to do that. And so over the holiday break, when a lot of people were spending time with family and taking it easy, I was really kind of pushing particle illusion to as far as I can. And so I started making some examples, and the idea was I was going to build some examples for Brian to use in some marketing materials or something, but I just wanted to really kind of push it as hard as I could and see what I could do. And the experimentation has always been really the great part with particle illusion for me. And it's always a lot of fun. So that was just another thing. Like, don't think, this so sad that he's working over the holidays. It was actually a lot of fun to do this. So it was not all work. It was a lot of play as well. And so I was never intending to build any sort of coherent project out of it. It was more a bunch of separate examples. But then as I started working on them, I realized that they were kind of maybe telling a little bit of a story. And that might be too strong of a word to use, but it seemed like it was evolving into something that kind of could be seen as a story. And so I decided to add sound and music and do the whole, edit the whole thing together and make a little movie out of it. So it's not going to win any awards, but this is kind of my my fun time over the holidays, putting together something kind of interesting and beautiful, I think. So let's maybe take a look at it now. If Brian's got it queued up. So a little bit about that before I start showing you how I created all of it. I built the whole thing in After Effects in 4K, and I used the plugin version of Particle Illusion, even though everything I'm going to be showing can also be done. Most of it can be done in the standalone, so I'll be showing the standalone version today. Right, so we've got library scenes in the preset, which is like a whole project inside a preset now. So you know which ones are the scenes because it has a plus sign on the name, and it also doesn't have a live preview, it's just got a thumbnail. So I started with this preset, and I just double click to add that. And this is just you can see where it's going already. Here's an orange and a blue emitter going toward each other in a fluid object. And you can see that just by adding that one preset, it added the force object, which was set up as fluids already, and added the 2 emitters, and everything's there, good to go. So it's really a great new way of kind of get some really advanced presets going. And I'm going to be working in HD here, but I'm going to show you how I converted this preset, which was designed for HD, into 4K, just as a kind of a little exercise to start us off. But then I'll switch back to HD, and just so everything's more responsive. So you can see PI is set to 1920 by 1080 up in the upper right corner here. And I want to change this to 4K. So I go to the View and Project Settings menu. And then here I can either manually set the width and the height or just select a preset. So I'm just going to select the 4K 2997 is fine. And you can see what's happened. I'm using Command plus and minus to zoom in and out, or Control plus and minus on Windows. You can see that the frame has increased to 4K, but all the objects are still just the same as they were. And that's because there's no particle illusion doesn't know how to scale all those things up. So I have to manually adjust this a little bit, but it's pretty simple. I just drag the items out of the frame, which is where they were before, and I can drag up the radius of the force object just to make sure it covers my entire frame. And you can see that you got some changes happening already. The fluids have reorganized themselves, let's say. And this is one of the things that John mentioned, and the question was talking about, like, will it render the same every time? It will, but if I change this radius just a little bit, you'll see everything change a little bit, because it changes, all the sort of dimensions of the fluids area and everything. So as long as you don't make the slightest change to certain things, it will render the same. If I just save this and pull it out, it'll render again. All right, so since I was going with a 4K project, I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I'm only at 25% here. The particles are still pretty big and chunky, and I want the increased resolution of 4K. So the first thing I did was take the size of the particles and kind of just cut those in half. And I'm going to only adjust the orange one. We're going to leave the blue one as reference. And so you can see the particles got a much smaller, but now there's not nearly enough of them. So I needed to increase the number. And so if you notice, the number parameter is outlined in red, which means it's got keyframes. And you can see what's selected down in the graph window down here. You can see, yes, it is keyframes, so that the emitter is on and then it turns off at some point. And so I can't just change this value. I have to modify these keyframes. And there's several ways to do it. The most straightforward is to just use the keyframe navigation buttons and jump between the keyframes and just type the value. So that's one way to do it. And I think I might want like maybe 5 times the amount. So I'm going to just change that to 100. And you'll see the change there. That can get a little bit tedious, though, especially if the number of keyframes was a lot. Let's say this was a lot more complex animation. So the other thing I could have done is I could have, in the graph window itself, I could have just clicked on nothing to select no data keys, and then just select both of those, and then kind of drag it up and down to increase or decrease the particles, and that would have the same effect. It's not precise, so I don't typically do that. But there is a kind of a trick you can use when you've got the number animated. If you remember, I should say, that any emitter that is a volume or has a length or a size, if you increase that volume or increase that length or size, the number of particles increases as well. So one thing I could do is just take this box emitter and, let's say, increase the depth. So instead of 100, I'll make that 300. And you'll see every time I change this, you'll see more particles are being created. And the height I'll just make it, let's say, 500. And now you're seeing I'm getting a lot more particles being created. There we go. And now that's starting to look a lot more like if I look at the render here, that's more typical of what the render was. And if I zoom in a little bit, you can see it's just got a lot more detail to it now. And then I would do the same thing on the blue emitter. You can see now I've already increase particles quite a bit, but I'm not going to work at 4K. It's going to slow things down quite a bit. So I'm going to be working here at the HD level. And so I'll just reopen a project that's got that in it to collide. So this is the same preset, but it's tweaked a little bit. It's got a few more particles in it and just tweaked slightly. But this is what I started with. And you can see that it's got the one fluid object and it's got just the two emitters, and that's it. And the force on the fluids is 0. It's just a sort of a container for the fluids. And then the velocity is coming from the emitters themselves. So that's the thing to remember about particle illusion fluids, is that the fluids themselves do not move. The particles are what impart their motion to the fluids. And then if there's no particles, there's no motion of fluids. Think of it that way. And so you need moving particles to make things happen. But then once they pretty much just happen on their own. It's a simulation. You don't have a lot of control over, where exactly those fluids are going to be swirling, because that's how things work in the real world. It just happens as it happens. But what you can do is you can start moving things around. I could change the angle of these emitters or something. And that's kind of how my experimentation started with this project. Is I said, okay, let's just say, what happens if now they're not hitting straight on? Maybe they're hitting a glancing blow. So I'll move the one emitter down a little bit, and I'll move the other emitter up the same amount. And then you can see now that the way they are interacting is really quite a bit different than before. They're passing each other, but then they're dragging, blue is dragging along orange particles and vice versa, and then they're starting to swirl. And it's really a really complex and beautiful way of working. I can't really control that other than by controlling my emitters. But then I started thinking, like, there's, that's another cool variation. Why don't I try some other things? And so I went back to the.
Can I interrupt you for 2 seconds though, Alan?
Yeah, please.
Is that all right? Because I think while we're here, I just want to go back to one of the questions that was asked in the chat a little bit earlier.
Okay.
Because we're working with a 3D project here, yeah, and we're working with 3D emitters, 3D forces. The question was, how do we move around that? Do we have a camera, or do you have to be using the plug-in version to have camera movement within this?
No, that's a great question. So the answer is you do not need to use the plug-in version for a camera, because we have a built-in camera. I guess I don't need to zoom out. The way you access the camera is click on nothing, so that no objects are selected in the node, and then you'll see the camera controls show up here. And if I select a camera model, there's a few different types. I'm going to select the orbit one, because this is one that I seem to use quite a bit. And with this, I can now just rotate the camera. Tumble it down a little bit. There we go. Then I can adjust the zoom, or I can adjust if I use the position model, now I can go ahead and animate the position of the camera and the rotation as well. It's a little more, the orbit one is sort of a simpler model, but I like to use it because I typically only ever sort of orbit around things. So that's what we get there. Also, you do have different views, like as John was showing. You can jump to a world view and see an oblique angle of the setup, or you can jump to the left or right views to see how everything's interacting. Is that enough about that, do you think, Ben, or do we need to talk more about camera?
That is perfect. No,
that's
great. That answers the question perfectly.
Was another question, or are we ready to move on?
I think we'll move on. I'll keep interrupting you and be annoying, but I think we'll move on.
That sounds fine. All right. We should have
Excellent.
a bell sound that you can ring. You can ring a bell, and then I'll know to stop talking.
I'll
All right.
get that for
So,
next time.
if you remember the from the video, I then had something, one of the emitters passing through another one. So I thought that would be something kind of neat, is to have a stationary emitter. So I decided, I think randomly, that the orange one was going to be the sort of one who's always moving around. The blue one was going to turn stationary. So the first thing I did, turn velocity down to 0, because I don't need it to move at all. I need those particles to just sit there. And then dragged it over. I also, you may have noticed as I move this around, those emitters are rotating. That was a trial that I did to try to make the motion more complex. In this case, for the wall of particles, it's just kind of getting in the way. So I'm going to jump back, and I'm just going to get rid of the rotation of that blue emitter. So now it's just stationary. And then I can just drag it and make it into roughly the sort of shape I want. And then we'll take a look and see how that looks. And not too bad. When I first did this, I was pretty excited about the way that the blue particles were just kind of pushed out of the way, and then they move back down. One thing I noticed, though, if I look at the world view again, maybe it's more obvious in the left, is that I didn't really make a wall of particles. This is looking left, so we're looking like right down the axis of the orange emitter. I made like a column of particles. It's not really a wall. I really wanted a wall of blue. So if I look at this, it's because the depth is only 100. I was just about to type 1,000 to make it, much wider, but I do know that, like I said before, if you increase the volume of an emitter, then the number of particles is going to go up quite a bit. And I want to make sure that I don't get, 1,000,000 particles before I'm ready for them. So first thing I'm going to do is just crank this down quite a bit. So it was at 80. Also realize that there's an extra data point here that I don't want. I'm going to get rid of that one. And so then we're going to take this down to 5. So it's just going to be very, very thin, small amount of particles. And we're going to switch back to our render view. And I'm going to make the depth of that guy now. Now it's really obvious that it's just pushing through there. But now I'm just going to make that 1,000 now. And let's see what we get. Yeah, that's actually pretty close to what we had before. And if we look back at the left, yeah, now I've got a full wall of particles that the orange is pushing through, and it seems to be totally encompassing the whole orange blast. So I think that's exactly what I wanted. And so that's what I did. One thing to point out, since I was going to be using this in maybe in a project that was going to show these one after another, I didn't change anything about the orange emitter at all. It's exactly the same as it was in the previous version. Probably you wouldn't notice because the other one had the blue one moving, and so we had blue particles moving the fluids and orange moving the fluids, so things would have been kind of mixing up nicely. If I do multiple versions where the orange is the only one moving, it will look exactly the same because this one's not causing any fluid motion at all. So that's kind of a long way of saying that it would be nice to change something about this emitter in every example. So I just went up into the orange one and went to the random seed in the properties and just changed that value to something different. And you'll see that all changed somewhat. Definitely a thing I noticed that I wasn't doing at first, and it looked a little weird that in every example, the orange emitter looked almost identical. It just looked a little weird. So
random seed is really valuable, isn't it, Alan? Because once you've set up a simulation in pretty much how you like it, just being able to change the random seed can quickly give you lots of different variations on that theme.
Definitely. And if you're thinking, the fluid's force object should have a random seed too, It's really not necessary because, you already saw, like just a slight change to the radius of the force changes things up. So there's really almost nothing you can't change that will make the fluids look different. So if changing the emitter random seed is going to give you a different kind of fluids pattern anyway, so that it was redundant to have a fluids randomness. So if you're looking for it,
Yeah,
don't worry about it. Just use the emitter one instead.
Yeah, I think that goes back to what the question was a little bit earlier. It's like, if are these things absolutely random? Like, will it be different when you open the project up again? It's like, well, no, it won't, because it's things like, it's a simulation. So long as you're going on the journey from the same point, you're going to end up at the same destination. But the random seed gives you that kind of controlled randomness that you might want if something's not quite looking exactly how you want it. Just even adding one number to the random seed can create a very different result.
Exactly. All right, I'm going to keep moving on then. So then if we look at the clip again, I tried another variation on the box emitter, just a bigger box, and that's fine. That's kind of nice. You can see how I'm not using motion blur right now in this part, but if I toggle that on, you can see the change it makes. I'm using 10 frames of motion blur here. Like I said, I might usually would crank that up even more for a smoother blurring, but it definitely adds a lot of energy to the piece. But then the one I think that really hit me as being kind of fun is the sphere. So that's what I'm going to do here. And this was really just a simple change. I took the blue emitter as it was, as a box, and I just went into the properties and changed it to a sphere. And I'm going to back up in time a little bit. And then I just dragged the radius up a bit, and I moved it over just to give me a little clearance. And that's kind of all I did at first. And I just, if you look at this, it's really exciting to me how the blue sphere kind of bulges out and then collapses back around behind it. It's just really great. And they're getting dragged. It's just, again, like it's all simulation. I'm not, you couldn't animate that if you wanted to. It's just too complex. But then I looked at this and thought, well, okay, the same sort of thing. Like, do I need more particles? And, in this case, the only thing I can do to increase the volume is to change the radius, but I don't want to change the radius. So I was forced to go ahead and maybe double the number of particles here by changing that to 10, and to do it the slow way. And that just gave me a lot more particles to go with. And, that one workaround, you'll notice up here, the number of particles is displayed up here. If it starts becoming too slow for you, you feel like maybe your system is not up to it. And I guess I should point out, I'm not on a great system. This is quite an old iMac. It's 2017, so this is not a high-end system measure. And I was going to say, one trick you could do to fill this in is, rather than increase the number of particles, I went ahead and undid that, so they went back to what it was. And then I would go ahead and just maybe increase the size a little bit if you need more, more fill in without taking that performance hit. And that gives me a more visible blue sphere. But again, for my project, that I always went for the more particles approach rather than bigger particles. So, in the 4K version, I would possibly even decrease the size more and then add more particles. And then the next example was, if you remember, was a white sphere in the middle of the blue sphere. And this was about as easy as it gets. I just selected the blue item, and then I went to the little hamburger menu and duplicated the emitter. Then I took, with that new emitter, I just want to rename that so I don't get confused about which one I'm editing. And this is white. It's actually a sphere, but that's fine. I'll go ahead and do that. And change the position a little bit because they're right on top. It's right on top of the other one, and then maybe take the radius down a bit. And then you might be wondering what all these gradients are over here. And if you've used PI before recently, you know that that's the particle gradient, and the particles should be starting their life at orange and then turning aqua and then turning red at the end of their life. And these clearly aren't doing that. They're all just blue and orange and whatever. And that's because I'm using the emitter tint color with 100% tint strength. So it's overriding, the tint color is overriding the particle color completely. And so in this case, to make this one white, I just need to go ahead and take that tint color and change it to something more white. And I think the radius is still quite big. And the position is wrong. I'm just going to drag that in. And I might go ahead. That looks reasonable. And there's another variation. And I started getting kind of excited about some of that because the small white one seems to really grow even more than the blue one. And I just, like I said, I was having fun, right? Just experimenting. And so then we're going to skip over some of these other examples. I did, a white wall with the blue, white horizontal, which was pretty fun, and then 2 horizontals. And then this is the one that I want to look at next because this one I think is my favorite. And this really wasn't that difficult to do from where we are right now. So we need a bunch of streams. First, I'm going to get rid of the white one. I'm just going to create one of these to begin with. I'm also going to get rid of the orange temporarily by disabling it. So go up to the hamburger menu and disable that. And now orange particles are no longer around. This now I'm going to convert back to a box. And I'm going to kind of stretch it out into a long, skinny box. And let's say drag it down. And what we have now is, turn the velocity back on. I don't really know how much velocity I need, but I think it was somewhere around 1200. And you can see a couple problems. One, the particles are emitting to the left, and they're not coming out in streams. They're just coming out in, as a big box of particles. So let's take care of the emission first. That's the emission angle. And so I'll spin that open, and we can see that I need to rotate that in Z, 90 degrees or minus 90. I'm not sure which. So I'm just going to say 90. And that was right. Okay. And so now we've got the particles going up. But the key to getting them into streams is using the emit at points option right here. So I'm going to check that. And right now it's just set to emit at 1 point along every axis. So I've got a single point. Make that 10 along X, I think is what I set to before. And I can see that these are like really wimpy, thin streams. I need to fix that. So my first thought is like, I'll increase the number, but I won't do that yet. The emission range is only 10 degrees. So that could be explaining why it's so thin. So I'm going to just crank that up a little bit. And that kind of that spreads them out a little bit. I still need a lot more particles. Rather than messing with the number, which is animated again, why don't I just I'm going to add a few copies in the Y. So maybe 3 copies. And now it's emitting. You can't really see it because they're blending, which is exactly what I wanted. But now there's 3 times as many particles. I might even just make that 5. You can't tell. But that looks pretty good. Looks pretty reasonable. So I'm going to leave that one alone, and I'm going to duplicate this, just like we did before. And this one's going to be the white one. And for renaming, one shortcut is highlight its name in the controls view, and then hit enter or return. And then you get the rename right away. You don't have to do the menu. And the position, need to put that up at the top. So I'm just going to make that negative to mirror it. And then change the tint color to white. And then the emission angle needs to be also reversed. All right.
Can I
And
just
I
say
guess
while you're doing that,
yeah,
just how much I just want to just highlight the fact how easy all of this stuff is now that you can just duplicate stuff on the nodes, and I've used that quite a bit with the some of the emitters that I've created, of just sort of taking a little element, duplicating it up, changing it just subtly, and then having it as part of the main project. I think that really does make things a lot easier.
The node workflow. If you haven't used PI in a while, we introduced the nodes in the previous release. It just made everything much more accessible and just so much simpler to understand. All right, so now I've got something that looks reasonable now. Let's see with some motion blur. Yeah, that's not bad. I'm not sure exactly what's happening. There's some gaps and things, but you get the idea. I converted what was just a sphere emitter into a box of streams using the emit at points option. And then I duplicated it to make the white one. And now I can go ahead. Let's turn the orange one back on. Enable that. And now a couple things. If you look at the video again, you notice that the orange one is delayed and doesn't start interacting until the other streams are already kind of mixing. And in this case, in this example already, the orange turns on right at the beginning. That's easily fixed though. And you might think you might have to, adjust a bunch of keyframes or whatever, but it's really simple. Just select the emitter in the node view, and then it's this start frame bar. You can grab the little handle here and drag that. So if I don't want it to turn on for 30 frames or whatever, I just drag it over to 30. And you can see that all the keyframes and everything were repositioned as well. See, it's super simple. And then if I didn't like that, I could just drag that back. So it's really a great way to adjust that stuff. So it turns on. You can see right away when it does turn on, it's being affected by the fluid motion that's already there, which is just how that's how PI works with fluids. If I didn't want, let's say that I wanted the orange to, let's say, be a lot more dominant and push through and maybe not be influenced by the other particles as much. That's what the effect fluids parameter is for. And they all default to 100 to begin with. But let's say I didn't want, I wanted that orange to be a lot more powerful. Let's say I can double this to 200, let's say. And now the orange is going to influence the fluids a lot more. Maybe even put that up a lot more. Orange is now overpowering and plowing through. And you can see it's dragging those blue and white particles over. And if I change that back to 100, it's going to be at the same frame. It's going to be much, it's barely making it through because they all have equal sort of say in what the fluids are doing. And this is much easier to see now with motion blur turned on, because now you can get a sense for where all the particles are moving.
Alan, quick
that's how that
question
was
for
set
you.
up. And go ahead.
This is just about velocity versus weight. So you've got your blue particles. Obviously, you've rotated your emitter and pointing it down, and you've got your white one pointing up, and you're using velocity to move those particles. Would there be a situation where you wouldn't use velocity, but you'd use the weight of the particles, positive and negative weights, and how would that affect the simulation?
It's pretty much the same. Now the difference is, let me turn off the, boy, that's going to be, I'm trying to see how I can show this without messing too much up. If I turn let's say blue, I'm going to take blue, I'm going to turn the velocity to 0. So there's no velocity. I'm not sure if these particles have weight yet, but let's say they do. Weight, I'm going to set weight to 100. and we'll see what happens here. Nope, they're heavy. Yeah, so if these were, let's say these were light particles with a negative weight value makes particles rise. So these are going to be, the blue one now is, okay, rising particles, and we're going to crank up that weight scaling factor, maybe even more. The thing about weight is it's an acceleration, right? So it starts out at 0 and then picks up speed as it goes. So it's going to have the same sort of impact on the fluids. Actually, let me turn the white one, affect fluids, to 0. The blue one is 100. Orange, I'm going to turn that to 0. So now blue is the only thing moving fluids. So it's got its weight. So the weight of the particles, the rising particles now, is affecting the fluids. And you can see now that it has the same net effect on fluids. It doesn't matter if the particle motion comes from velocity parameter or from the weight parameter or anything. Or even if weight and, let's say weight and velocity were both 0 on this. So like now those shouldn't be moving at all. Yeah, blue is just sitting there. Like you said in your presentation, John, if you had a force object here, oops. There we go. And let's say we'll rotate that force guy, rotate him 90 degrees. Now crank up the strength a little bit, but he is now affecting those particles, right? And now those particles are affecting the fluids, whereas the other ones are not. These guys are nothing. But the fluids, now that the fluids are moving, some of these guys are going to start moving a little bit. But that's the whole thing. It doesn't really matter how the particles move. 3 different
ways to control it. Yeah,
exactly.
I was going to say, 3 different ways to control it.
Go ahead, John.
And velocity and weight, and as you said, with a force object, 3 different ways to push the particles around. I mean, they will all give you slightly different results.
All right, and I want to show one more thing. So there's a few more sort of examples here of just more variations. In this case, I used, I think, a circle as opposed to a sphere. It's a 2D circle. Which ends up being kind of neat. There's something about that in a minute. And then I added the dark emitter in there as well. And then there was just more variation. But then when you get to the end here, it changed. And rather than having one separate emitter for each color, I started using a different feature of the plug-in version of particle illusion. And so in this case, it's a single emitter. That's a box. And then it's set... I go ahead and let's see which one's the easy one. So let's use the blue one. I got a lot of stuff I added to this. The blue one, we'll use white. Blue we're going to get rid of because he's confusing now. White particles are set to use their gradient, just normal. But if you see, you have a color from layer option. In that, if you set it to that, then those particles, there are 2 particle types here, so that's why they didn't all disappear. But if you set it to that, those will grab from a layer. But in the standalone version, there's no layer to grab from. There's no way to put a source image or anything underneath it. That's why I use the plugin version for that. And so in the plugin version, I just use an image of the logos or the blocky version of the logos, and then that's how I got that to look. And maybe Ben, I don't know if you've got your After Effects fired up. Maybe you can show that final logo. Probably.
I've got the 3 blocks here, and
why don't you do the
final logo as well? Here we go.
There you go. That's the one. Yep. And so you can see that's how. If you just scrub a little bit, you can see that it's just it formed the logo out of particles, and then they're just getting disrupted. So that's the only way to do that using the plugin version. I would like to point out something while you're on this, Ben. If you look at the parameters on the left, the particle properties section. Yeah. So using the plugin version, you saw me early on when I was adjusting the number of particles when there was 2 emitters, or whatever, and I would have to change it inside particle illusion for each emitter. So I had to decrease the size and increase the number for each emitter, and which is fine. There were only 2 emitters, but if for the more complex ones where there were 4 emitters, I'd have to do it for each one individually. That's why the plugin version is nice. I didn't need to actually do that at all. I just used this global scale factor in the particle properties for the plugin. And so I could increase the number. If I wanted 5 times more particles from all emitters, I just changed. I think it is set to 500, isn't it? It's set to 500 already. And the size is set to
600, yeah.
50, whatever. Yeah, it's so if you wanted the particles to be even smaller, just go ahead and change that size down to something smaller, and it would automatically affect all emitters in the project. It doesn't change them at the emitter level. It's a scaling factor that's applied at the plugin level, so it's not a destructive change.